Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to remind my colleagues across the aisle that President Trump said 15 days to slow the spread. 15 days is quite different from 6 months, 1 year, a year and a half, and even more. 15 days, big difference. And then he said reopen. So just want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. We can't rewrite history.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, absolutely not. We want history to remain truthful. Mr. Schwartzman, I listened to your testimony, and you said, like all fundamental rights, religious freedom has limits, especially when exemptions impose serious harms on other people. As Justice Robert Jackson once said, according to you, the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. You said under current law, particularly when the government has a compelling interest, such as preventing the spread of a deadly pandemic, it can impose restrictions on even the most cherished and important of our individual liberties, as long as it does so even-handedly. Mr. Schwartzman, casinos were mandated to cap at 50% capacity, but yet churches were capped at 50 people. Didn't even matter how many people are in their congregation. Do you consider that even-handedly?
I'm not a public health official or
That's a yes
official.
or no, Mr. Schwartzman.
Well, I think that's a question that you would have to ask Nevada state officials. And the Supreme Court, when it decided Calvary Chapel on July 24th, 2020.
Mr. Schwartzman, I'm asking you, do you consider in your opinion that even-handedly?
The court recognized, I think, that 1,100 people in the United States died the day that the Supreme Court made that decision, and it was for local officials to respond to those conditions on the ground as they saw fit. And
Mr. Schwartzman, shutdowns that supposedly prevent the spread of a virus cause suicides to increase in every single age group of all ages, but especially the highest in teenagers. Do you consider that even-handedly?
I'd say when the Supreme Court decided the New York case, 2,200 people died that day. When it decided the school closing case in December, 3,500 people died that day.
So, Mr. Schwartzman, you believe that teenagers should commit suicide because people with comorbidities such as obesity and people at very high risk of dying from COVID-19 is okay as long as the Supreme Court says so. Let's move on.
Absolutely
Liquor
not.
stores and marijuana dispensaries stayed open, liquor stores and dispensaries, but gyms had to close. And obesity was one of the leading comorbidities. That's not even-handedly. That's actually wrong that they shut down gyms. Let's talk about, was it right to put COVID patients in with our grandparents and parents in nursing homes, actually murdering them? Do you consider that even-handedly?
With respect, the risk of the various kinds of activities that you're describing varied greatly, and public health officials use scientific assessments and data to distinguish those kinds of activities and to regulate accordingly.
So you're talking about like Dr. Richard Levine, the man that calls himself supposedly Rachel Levine, when he pulled his own mother out of nursing homes in Pennsylvania, but as in his job, he was able to create the order to keep COVID patients in the nursing homes instead of sending them to hospitals. He pulled his own mother out, so officials like him were the experts. You consider that even-handedly?
I'm not familiar with that case.
Well, you should be familiar with it. It's pretty bad. He's our Deputy Secretary of Health, and he shouldn't be. Governments coordinated with social media to censor COVID misinformation, especially like mine, when I put up the fact that there were an exorbitant amount of reports on the VAERS reporting system over the COVID vaccine, but yet there were very little about other vaccines. And then the government coordinated with social media companies to make sure people like me had our accounts suspended. While they allow porn to proliferate, anyone is allowed to attack Donald Trump, anyone is allowed to say anything else as long as they stuck with the talking points of COVID and didn't spread COVID misinformation. I'm sure you have a Supreme Court case to quote on that. Do you consider that fair that the government coordinated with social media companies to censor the First Amendment rights of Americans?
In fact, there is no Supreme Court decision on this question, and there are, as far as I know, no federal court decisions that have found in any kind of final judgment or based on any jury verdict, any kind of collusion on the grounds that you're describing?
You are so misinformed. There's actually plenty of proof that the government colluded with social media to censor people, and I'm one of them right here. And I was a sitting United States member of Congress. I want you to know the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. It's important because it protects our rights. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.